Did you know some of history's most famous frozen bodies weren't accident victims at all? They were murdered, drugged, or buried alive. There's something deeply unsettling about staring into the face of a person who died on purpose thousands of years ago and still counting their eyelashes today. And the most disturbing part is how young most of them were. Today we're looking at 6 people found frozen in ice, and the details scientists uncovered were nothing they expected. In September 1991, 2 German hikers named Helmut and Erika Simon were walking a mountain pass over 3,200 meters up on the Italian-Austrian border when they spotted a body sticking out of melting ice. They assumed it was a lost climber from a few years back. Instead, it was Ötzi, a man who had been frozen for over 5,300 years, making him the oldest ice mummy ever found. He was found with a copper axe, a bow, and a quiver of arrows, tools well preserved enough to prove he was at least 4,000 years old the moment archaeologists laid eyes on him. For decades, scientists believed Ötzi froze to death after fleeing into the mountains following a fight. His damaged gear proved he never had time to repair his equipment. Then, in 2003, a CT scan found an arrowhead still buried in his shoulder. Ötzi hadn't frozen to death fleeing a scuffle. He had been shot and left to die. Even his broken quiver, once seen as battle damage, turned out to be nothing more than natural wear from the ice itself. Researchers later found his last meal preserved in his stomach: wild goat meat, red deer, and grains, eaten less than 2 hours before he died. They even found pollen in his gut, proving he died in spring, not autumn like everyone believed for years. Every new detail kept rewriting the story of exactly how he was killed. Today, 250,000 people visit his museum every year just to look at his face. And to this day, no one knows who fired that arrow or why. Ötzi wasn't the only frozen body hiding a violent secret. In 1984, forensic anthropologist Owen Beatty exhumed a grave on Beechey Island in the Canadian Arctic, hoping to solve a decades-old disaster. Back in 1845, the ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror sailed into the Arctic with 134 men searching for the Northwest Passage. They were last seen alive in July that year, and because the expedition carried 3 years of supplies, no rescue was sent until 1848, by which point nearly everyone was already dead. Search parties later collected Inuit accounts describing cannibalism among the starving survivors, along with a note found in a stone cairn confirming Franklin himself had died in 1847. Beatty's team dug over a meter down through frozen gravel until they hit a coffin lid. Inside was leading stoker John Torrington, dead since January 1846, preserved so perfectly by the permafrost that his eyes were still open. He weighed only 38.5 kilograms when he died, and tests on his hair revealed dangerously high levels of lead. When the team opened a second grave nearby, they found something even stranger. Sailor John Hartnell had already been autopsied by his own crewmates before burial, his body sewn back together by the ship's doctor, who was desperately trying to figure out why his men kept dying. Scientists now believe the true killer wasn't just lead poisoning, but tuberculosis and pneumonia tearing through a crew that was already starving and freezing. The wrecks of both ships weren't found until 2014 and 2016, discovered in locations that didn't match anyone's search, hundreds of miles from where the men were last seen alive. Not every disturbing find involved sailors or accidents, though. In 1999, archaeologists climbing the summit of the Llullaillaco volcano in Argentina, over 6,700 meters up, uncovered 3 Inca children buried in a shallow stone chamber, the highest archaeological site ever found on Earth. Radiocarbon dating placed their deaths around 500 years ago, during a ritual called Capacocha. The children had walked all the way to Cusco and back as part of the ceremony, dressed in fine woven clothing and buried with gold and silver figurines meant to honor their families forever. Hair analysis later revealed something disturbing. All 3 had been fed coca leaves and alcohol for up to a year before they died, with the oldest, a 13-year-old known as the Maiden, given far more than the other 2. Researchers believe she was being groomed to become something closer to a living deity before her death. On the night of the sacrifice, the children were given maize beer until they passed out, then carried into an underground chamber and left there to freeze. Scans of the Maiden showed she still had food in her stomach and hadn't relieved herself in hours, a sign she may have died peacefully in her sleep. The youngest of the 3, nicknamed the Lightning Girl, wasn't so lucky. Her mummy shows signs consistent with a lightning strike sometime after burial, scorching part of her body centuries after she was already dead. The sacrifices weren't limited to South America either. In 1993, archaeologist Natalia Polosmak was excavating a burial mound on Russia's remote Ukok Plateau when she found a solid block of ice at the bottom of the grave. Melting it slowly, her team uncovered the mummified body of a woman in her 20s, dressed in Chinese silk and buried alongside 6 horses and a final meal of meat, offerings usually reserved for someone of real status. When they lifted away her fur coat, a bright blue tattoo of a griffin-like creature appeared on her shoulder, still vivid after 2,500 years. Underneath a felt headdress, scientists made an even stranger discovery. She had been completely shaved bald, her real hair replaced by an elaborate wig built from 2 layers of human hair and topped with gold foil birds. Locals in the Altai region were furious when her body was taken away for study, believing she was a guardian spirit and blaming her removal for earthquakes that followed. Decades later, an MRI scan revealed she had likely died of breast cancer in her 20s and that her organs had been removed and replaced with peat and moss during a burial that took months to complete. In 2012, after years of pressure from local communities, she was finally returned to the Altai Republic, where she remains sealed inside a climate-controlled mausoleum built to mimic the very permafrost that once kept her hidden. Sometimes the disturbing part wasn't a weapon or a drug, but a tradition. In 1972, 2 brothers hunting birds in Greenland stumbled onto a pile of stones hiding 8 bodies, mummified naturally by the freezing Arctic air. Dated to around 1475, the group included 6 women and 2 children, one of them a 6-month-old baby so well preserved that the hunters initially mistook him for a doll. When researchers examined the infant more closely, they found something the family never intended anyone to see. The baby appeared to have been buried alive alongside his already dead mother. Inuit custom at the time held that an infant who lost its mother and had no one left to nurse it would be sent to die with her rather than starve slowly on its own. To modernize, it looks like cruelty. To the people who lived there 5 centuries ago, it was considered mercy. The bodies were recovered along with 78 pieces of clothing sewn from reindeer and seal skin, and their faces still carried fine tattoos across the forehead, chin, and cheeks. The mummies were so well preserved that scientists could examine their last meals and even the parasites still in their stomachs, giving researchers one of the clearest windows ever into a culture that otherwise left almost nothing behind. Not every frozen body stays a mystery forever, though. In August 1999, 3 sheep hunters walking through a melting glacier in British Columbia noticed a walking stick and a scrap of fur sticking out of the ice. What they'd found was the body of a young man, later named Kwadai Dan Tsinchi, meaning long ago person found, who had died between 300 and 550 years earlier, wearing a robe stitched together from roughly 95 gopher and squirrel pelts. His stomach and intestines were still intact enough that scientists could reconstruct his final meal and retrace his last movements before he died. In 2008, researchers tested DNA from over 240 volunteers across First Nations communities in British Columbia, Yukon, and Alaska, hoping to find a connection. They found 17. All 17 shared the same maternal ancestor as the man frozen in the glacier, and 15 of them belonged to the Wolf clan, confirming his own clan centuries after his death. At a symposium where the results were revealed, some of his living relatives openly wept, thanking the hunters who had found him. For the first time in the history of glacial archaeology, an ancient body wasn't just studied. It was recognized as family and eventually cremated and returned to his community instead of being kept on a shelf. Ice keeps stranger secrets than anyone expects. Subscribe for more disturbing history frozen in time.